Welcome to The Bunk, your source of fact-checking information from the mainstream media to your auntie's Facebook ramblings. I'm your host, James, and there is no Lucy this week. She is away sick, and I am sick and tired. Why am I sick and tired? Because I've been studying Andrew Wakefield for the last 2 weeks, and I am over this topic. Who is Andrew Wakefield, you ask? Well, stick around for an intriguing story of fraud, child abuse, and one man's quest to become the world's biggest mass murderer. But first I want to talk a little bit about Patreon. If you haven't heard about Patreon, it's a great way to support your favourite media content provider. You can go online, make a per episode donation, and if you like, you can set a monthly cap so that I can't go online and make 100 episodes and drain your bank account. Also, there can be little patron-only goodies that are on offer. I'm working on setting a few of those, but at the moment, you can go online and download uncensored versions of the podcast. Yes, there will be swearing, starting from now, except not this week because this episode is scripted. Because it is just me tonight talking to myself. Have pity for me. World's smallest violin. Minute of silence. Right, and let's just jump right into it. So many of you might have heard of Andrew Wakefield, and for those who haven't, you definitely would know of his legacy. He is known to many as the father of the anti-vaccine movement due to his 1998 paper in The Lancet linking vaccines to anti-inflammatory bowel disease and autism. The study has since been retracted, and Wakefield himself has had his medical license revoked due to controversy surrounding how the study was conducted and conflicts of interest. The scandal involves allegations of fraud, medical misconduct, ethical violations, child abuse, and misleading the public, resulting in one of the largest medical scares in modern history and resulting in the resurgence of deadly childhood diseases. Andrew Jeremy Wakefield of Eton, United Kingdom, qualified as a medical doctor from St Mary's Hospital Medical School in 1981. Taking up a specialty as a gastroenterologist. In the late 1980s, he began a career in academia, obtaining interest in Crohn's disease. The path that would lead him to draw a link between MMR and autism began in 1993, with a paper entitled Evidence of Persistent Measles Virus Infection in Crohn's Disease. The paper drew a correlation between measles infection and the common debilitating bowel disease. This hypothesis was further drawn upon in his 1995 paper, Is measles vaccination a risk for inflammatory bowel disease? The study followed up on the recipients of a trial measles vaccine from 1964 and drew a correlation between the recipients of the vaccine and inflammatory bowel disease. It's important to note for future consistency that the 1964 trial involved a monovalent measles vaccine. That is to say, the vaccine only covered one strain of the disease. The MMR vaccine, for reference, is a trivalent vaccine covering measles, mumps, and rubella, and was not introduced until 1989. Around the time that this study was released, according to Wakefield, he was approached by the parents of autistic children. He claims that his first interaction, which he remembers a specific date for, involved a mother who called him up and claimed him that she had a child who was diagnosed as autistic after receiving their MMR vaccine. "I'm a gastroenterologist. How can I help you?" he said. She then claimed that the child had also suffered from severe abdominal discomfort, something which was in Wakefield's line of work. The chronology of this conversation does seem a little odd, but continuing. He then claims that he was approached by a flood of mothers whose children had developed autism after receiving their MMR vaccine. How lay parents specifically of autistic children came to know of an obscure academic gastroenterologist as an ally in their claims against the MMR vaccine also seems a little odd. His earlier study had not specifically focused on the MMR vaccine, and his link between the monovalent measles vaccine and IBD had drawn no correlation with autism. Indeed, his later publications would focus specifically on the MMR vaccine, and he would initially make a strong recommendation for the discontinuation of MMR in favour of a monovalent vaccine. In 1996, his study turned to focusing on the link between MMR and autism. According to Wakefield, he was also approached in 1996 by Richard Barr, a lawyer with Dawbarn Solicitors, in order to appear as an expert witness in a class action lawsuit against vaccine manufacturers. However, according to a May 1997 newspaper from Dawbarns, Wakefield was commissioned by the law firm to assist with a class action lawsuit to be funded by the UK Legal Aid Board. Wakefield's responsibility was to conduct a pilot study to confirm a link between the MMR vaccine and autism. A newspaper article in The Independent dated November 1996, referring to William Kessig, one of the children in the study, states, William is one of 10 children taking part in a pilot study at the Royal Free Hospital in London, which is investigating possible links between the measles vaccine with the bowel disorder Crohn's disease and with autism. The study has been organised by Norfolk solicitors Daw Barnes, one of two firms awarded a contract in 1994 to coordinate claims resulting from the MMR vaccine. 10 of the 12 participants in Wakefield's study were claimants in the lawsuit, with 6 of these being claimants before their involvement in Wakefield's study, including William Kessick, the autistic son of Rosemary Kessick, the first parent that Wakefield claims contacted him. This contradicts Wakefield's later claims that the claimants were involved sometime after his commencement of the study, and that the study was funded entirely by the National Health Service and not by the UK Legal Aid Board. Any confusion regarding this can be clarified with a rather frank discussion between journalist Brian Deere and the organiser of the lawsuit, Richard Barr, who discusses how he believes there was no major issue with the study being funded by the Legal Aid Board, referring to it here by its more modern name, the Legal Services Commission. Brian Deere begins the conversation.
If Dr. Wakefield was part of drawing up that proposal to the Legal Services Commission to do these things on the 10, I mean, I don't know why 10. I mean, presumably that's what you had to hand at the time. And presumably, I mean,
it was 12, wasn't it? 12?
Well, it was 12 in the paper, but 10 in the Legal Service Commission only paid for 10. But then
yeah. Right. Oh, okay.
Yeah. Well, that's what they say. I mean,
well, I'd have to look back and see what we said to them at the time. But it sticks in my mind that it was 12. But never mind. I mean, you may be right. You've probably got better information than I have.
But it's just the public would think, well, hang on a minute. This paper that appeared in the Lancet did not give any disclosure about the sources of its financing, and if the public realised that this was done for the Legal Services Commission, they might interpret the paper quite differently.
Well, again, two questions there. Certainly at the time there was no secret about it. We weren't trying to sort of get an independent paper published under the carpet. I remember noting at the time that the funding acknowledgement wasn't there, but it didn't seem to be a big deal because it just wasn't a big deal in those days. Things have moved on since then, and I think now, if it had been done again, one would disclose down to the last penny because that's the way that the trend has gone. I mean, it's not the only piece of investigation of this nature that's been funded by the Legal Service.
No, sure.
I mean, there's one, for instance, that I fished out the other day. You know the Camelford reservoir that was filled with some horrible aluminium substance? And there was a study there that was funded by the Legal Services Commission, and the BMJ did a report on it, and it just acknowledged the study at the end.
Right.
And, so I don't think it's people would obviously factor it in, just like people factor in the fact that a lot of the studies in relation to autism and MMR are funded either by government agencies like the Madsen paper or by pharmaceutical companies like Peltola papers. It's just something one, notes. Generally speaking, I think scientists are reasonably ethical, and you just note it and say, well, perhaps he who pays the piper and so on.
So basically, you had you had a chat with your experts, you sat down and worked out a plan of what you thought needed to be done.
Yeah, I mean,
went to the LSC.
I think the word was expert at that stage. I hadn't even met some of the others who then subsequently became involved, all the people on that paper, like Peter Harvey, Simon Murch, John Walker Smith, and so on. So, basically, it was actually regarded as quite a sort of small thing at the time, and we did it, and got the approval, got the funding, and sort of moved on.
In a letter to The Lancet in anticipation of a 2004 expose produced by Brian Deere, Wakefield sent a letter to Lancet editor Richard Horton protesting that the Legal Aid Board did not fund the study and that any claims to the contrary would smear the reputations of his colleagues. This is Richard Horton, then editor of The Lancet, reading that letter.
He says, the Legal Aid Board contributed in no way to the funding of the report on the 12 children in the Lancet study, and were not therefore acknowledged. The clinical decision to investigate and report these children was not motivated in any way by whether that it was impugns the reputation of all the authors involved.
This, of course, contradicts the aforementioned John Walker Smith's claims that he knew nothing about the lawsuit, thus making him inculpable of any claims against his reputation.
And there was no awareness of any legal involvement with these cases as we saw them. We saw them by clinical need.
But you must have known that in August 1996 the Legal Services Commission entered into a contract
Absolutely not.
for £55,000.
Absolutely not.
And that the preliminary report was submitted to the Legal Services Commission in January 1999.
Absolutely not. I've never seen that. I've had absolutely nothing whatever to do with any of the legal things, nor has any, and Dr. Nurture, any of the clinicians looking after the children.
Wakefield's involvement in the lawsuit was also discussed among higher authorities such as the dean of his medical school, with urgent ethical questions also following the study. Also around this time, with the exact chronology unknown, Wakefield became involved with Hugh Freudenberg. Freudenberg was a former doctor and academic who had previously presented a correlation between vaccines and autism, which had since been discredited. One of his papers was even cited in Wakefield's 1998 paper. Freudenberg had been cautioned in 1989 by the FDA for injecting unauthorized blood products into autistic children, and was struck off in 1995 for unauthorized prescriptions for drugs that he was using himself. In his defense, he admitted to taking the drugs, claiming that he was taking them to deal with fibromyalgia. Freudenberg appears, with his name curiously misspelled, as a co-author along with Wakefield in two 1997 patent applications for a combination monovalent measles, irritable bowel disease, autism vaccine/treatment, and a test for irritable bowel disease and autism based off the assumption that the measles strain used in the MMR vaccine is responsible for irritable bowel disease and autism. For clarity's sake, I will focus on these patents later, but it is important at this point to notice the first line of one of these applications. The present invention relates to a new vaccine/immunization for the prevention and or prophylaxis against measles virus infection, and to a pharmaceutical or therapeutic composition for the treatment of irritable bowel disease, particularly Crohn's disease, and ulcerative colitis, and regressive behavioral disease, also referred to as pervasive developmental disorder. In this context, regressive behavioral disease is referring to autism. Freudenberg would later deny involvement with the autism cure claims of these patents, claiming that he had the cure for autism, which he charged over $700 per hour for, which involved preparations made in his kitchen from his own bone marrow.
Now, Dr. Wakefield also claimed at one point to have discovered a treatment, possibly a complete cure for autism.
He was wrong. He wanted to be involved in that. I would have been part of it. It didn't make sense to me. I forget what it was, but it didn't make sense.
That was the one with the goats?
Yeah.
That didn't make any sense then?
No.
So where was he getting that from?
I don't know. It's just a wild idea, I guess. He wanted to set up a corporation, make me a partner. Give me £60,000 or something. I wanted no part of it.
And what would that do, that corporation?
I had to make money, I guess. I told I wasn't interested in money. I wanted to make it quite clear I was doing this for scientific motives, not for monetary motives.
Despite the fact that the professor's name features on the patent documents, he claims it was put there without his consent. He wants nothing more to do with the pregnant goat capsules. He says he's invented a better treatment, which he makes in his kitchen.
Now, using this technology, do you believe that autism can be cured?
Yes.
Cured?
Yes. It's cheap, it's oral, no injections. One pill a day, every other day for 3 to 6 months.
And where does that come from?
From my bone marrow.
From your own personal bone marrow?
Yeah.
In 1998, the paper Ileal Lymphoid Nodular Hyperplasia Nonspecific Colitis and Pervasive Developmental Disorder in Children was printed in The Lancet. The paper was a result of the pilot study involving the aforementioned autistic children. The study claimed to present a correlation between MMR, ulcerative colitis, and autism. The article stopped short of suggesting a causative link, even asserting that it did not suggest a causative link, which Wakefield would later claim was evidence that no fraud was intended. However, even if fraud were intended, it would be ridiculous to claim a causal link after a pilot study of only 12 children and no tests were conducted for the presence of the measles virus. However, despite being only a pilot study, a press conference was held, which is a very unusual move, in which Wakefield made very clear recommendations to halt the use of the MMR vaccine in favour of a monovalent measles vaccine, later claiming that he had no choice given his previous studies linking measles vaccine to adverse events. This is despite the fact that his previous studies had focused on the monovalent vaccine only, and this was his first study involving the MMR vaccine, which was, again, only a small pilot study. The press conference was accompanied by a 20-minute video presentation which showed interviews with parents of autistic children voicing their own concerns that the MMR vaccine was directly responsible for their children's autism, with Wakefield again urging the use of a monovalent vaccine over the MMR vaccine. It's important to note that Wakefield never asserted anywhere in the press conference or in the press release that the MMR vaccine caused autism. However, the contents of the release heavily implied a causal link, and he allowed others to assert a causal link in his productions without refutation. This kind of smoke and mirrors act has become typical of Wakefield's behaviour, which will become apparent. The fallout from the publication and accompanying press conference was phenomenal, with vaccine rates tumbling around the world and sparking an anti-vaccine movement beyond the fringe in which it had previously existed. It also expanded to encompass all vaccines, not just the MMR vaccine. Almost immediately, concerns were raised over Wakefield's involvement in the class action lawsuit, with a letter published in The Lancet on the same year questioning his involvement. Wakefield defended his involvement in the lawsuit, claiming that it was only incidental, stating, "Only one author, Andrew Jeremy Wakefield, has agreed to help evaluate a small number of these children on behalf of the Legal Aid Board. These children have all been seen expressly on the basis that they were referred through the normal channels, example from general practitioner, child psychiatrist or community paediatrician, on the merits of their symptoms." This is at odds with the fact that half the children were involved with litigation prior to the involvement with Wakefield, as well as a newsletter dissemination by Dorbarn solicitors claiming that Wakefield had been commissioned by them to conduct the study, as well as a 1996 Independent article stating that Dorbarns was coordinating the study. Subsequent concerns have been raised, including the fact that the Legal Aid Board was never mentioned in the acknowledgement sections of the article, while the National Health Service was acknowledged for their financial contribution. This disparity was never addressed by Wakefield, even in a 2004 letter in response to this article being retracted for undisclosed conflicts of interest, though he defended it, until 2016, where Wakefield claims that he had sent a letter to Richard Horton, the editor of The Lancet, a year prior to the article being published, and that he, Horton, had conveniently forgotten about it. Why this claim has never been made until this point remains a mystery, as does any record of Horton's acknowledging the letter. Here is an audio clip from a 2016 promotional interview for his film Vaxxed, followed by an earlier interview from 2009, where he also explains Horton's knowledge of the litigation. It's interesting to note the disparity of when Horton knew about the litigation and Horton's level of knowledge of the litigation.
So in the UK there was then litigation by children against the manufacturers of the drug, and I became involved in that litigation. And patients within the Lancet study also became involved. Once they got their diagnosis and they were convinced that this is what happened, then they joined the litigation. It was alleged that the study was done for the purpose of litigation, indeed that it was funded by lawyers for litigation. That is absolutely untrue. It simply was not. So I agreed to be a medical expert, and I feel obliged to act as a medical expert on their behalf, because there were any number of doctors lining up on the other side to be paid as experts to act on behalf of the pharmaceutical industry. One of the allegations against me is that I had acted on behalf of lawyers. I was being paid by lawyers to do the Lancet study. In fact, I was being paid for by a government-funded compensation program to act as a medical expert. It had nothing whatsoever to do with the Lancet study, which was paid for by the National Health Service. The payment from the Legal Aid Board was not to me initially, it was to the medical school to conduct a study to look for evidence of measles virus in the diseased intestine of these children. That is what it specifically did. This was known to the editor of The Lancet nearly a year before the paper was published. He was sent documents from the lawyer saying, "We are working with Dr. Andy Wakefield on this issue." He knew or should have known, but conveniently he forgot that fact when it came to testify before the General Medical Council under oath. and it was only subsequently that it was disclosed that he knew all along. There have been some slightly difficult moments about differences of opinion, for example, with Richard Horton over conflicts of interest. And it's been interesting. The Lancet statement on conflict is, anything that would embarrass you if it were later disclosed. And my involvement with the Legal Aid Board didn't embarrass me at all. And it wasn't relevant, in my opinion, to disclose it in the Lancet paper because they didn't fund any of the Lancet paper. They funded a subsequent virological study, as was always intended. But it had been misrepresented in the media that they had funded the Lancet study and it wasn't disclosed. And this was the perception that Richard Horton originally had. And when I was asked about this by him way back in 2004, I said, no, they didn't fund this study at all. They funded a separate study. And he said, oh, well, on that case, it could be a potential or perceived as a potential conflict of interest. And I said, well, where did that come from? The statement, as I read it in the Lancet, the requirement is to disclose things that might embarrass you if they emerge later. And it was interesting because within that document, which was self-contained, anyone writing a paper for the Lancet would just need to read that. And the actual statement is the test of conflict of interest at the Lancet is an easy one. Anything that would embarrass you. And so you don't go beyond that. It's a self-contained document. Why would you go any further? But there's a website flagged up in there where you can go to that website, and there is a broader description of conflict of interest, which does include potential conflicts of interest or perceived conflicts of interest, which no one ever went to. Why would you do it? You've got it in front of you there. Now, there's a very, very big difference. Anything that would embarrass you is the active mood. Okay, it's what would embarrass me. So I can think, well, what would embarrass me? And I can make a decision about that. What others might perceive to be a conflict of interest is myriad. It goes on forever. You have to put yourself now in the third person and think, well, what might someone else, with their various views and biases, construe to be a conflict of interest? And that's massive. Where does that end? So that is a huge conceptual leap in terms of what you would disclose. And there was no formal way for doing it at the time. Now you have a document that you fill in the boxes saying, no shares, no this, no that. That's very straightforward. But in those days it wasn't. It was highly ambiguous. And it was always my intention, and always was disclosed, when there was direct funding for a study from a grant-giving body, or in this case the Legal Aid Board. And so in the viral study it was disclosed. This study was supported in part by the Legal Aid Board, and Dr. Wakefield has acted as an expert in the MMR litigation. That's an easy one, out it goes. But in the Lancet study, I felt no need to disclose it at all, nor did any of my colleagues who knew that I was involved with the Legal Aid Board and on behalf of some of these children. So that was a difficult moment, but it wasn't. It was a difference of opinion. He thought I should have disclosed it. I felt at the time that I didn't. Now, in retrospect, having seen this new document about perceived conflict, yeah, I can see that should have been disclosed, but there was no dishonesty, and he was good enough to say there was no intent to deceive. When Dr. Wakefield was asked about it, he was entirely open, said yes, there was this grant. We got into an argument, a debate about what was and what wasn't a conflict of interest, but there was absolutely no intent to deceive, and the charge is dishonesty. So he was extremely helpful in as much that he said, no, this was not dishonest. This was a genuine difference of opinion. And so that then largely resolved.
It's interesting to note that in the second interview, which was recorded earlier, Wakefield makes no statement regarding Horton being sent a letter by the lawyer informing him before the 1998 paper was released that there was involvement in litigation. For his work in the lawsuit, Wakefield was paid approximately £435,000, the highest paid individual witness in the class action lawsuit, as well as approximately £4,000 for expenses. These claims linking MMR vaccines, enterocolitis and autism were followed up with papers published in 2000, 2002 and 2004, with the paper in 2000 coining the term autistic enterocolitis, and the paper in 2002 showing evidence of viral replication in the gut of autistic children. It's important to note that this is the first time that he published evidence of the measles virus in his patients. In 2004, an investigation was printed in the Sunday Times, as well as a 50-minute documentary by journalist Brian Deere. In this expose, various damning allegations were made by Deere. These allegations including undisclosed conflicts of interest relating to the lawsuit or the patents, as well as cover-ups during his initial study, including not disclosing the lawsuit or his patent applications to his colleagues, as well as covering up negative test results for the measles virus during the original 1998 study. This investigation has become the central unfolding feature for Wakefield, not just in its inception, but also in the subsequent attempts of Wakefield himself to defend against allegations reveal further inconsistencies. While investigating these myself, I tried to rely on Deere's material as little as possible. After all, I preach skepticism of journalists, and Deere himself seemed to be pretty determined to bring Wakefield down, which could perhaps belie an ulterior motive. However, there are resources which he has provided which were not easily accessible when he conducted his investigation, which have since become available for free via authoritative sources to the public through the internet, including, for example, Wakefield's patents, previously only available by a visit to the London Patent Office, now accessible via their website. I was able to download these patents myself and consolidate them myself with everything Deere had claimed and provided. I was also able to correlate other resources, so for those I do not have access to myself, I consider him to be a reliable primary source, and any material that left loose ends was ignored. Furthermore, Wakefield sued Deere for defamation in 2007, but the lawsuit was retracted, with Deere being paid compensation for his legal fees. Most of the documents supplied by Deere are available via a Freedom of Information request and therefore would be easily proven false had they been manipulated or manufactured. The failure of Wakefield's defamation suit against Deere provides further evidence as to the authenticity of these documents, given the damage that the documents revealed inflicted upon Wakefield's career. Had the documents been false, they clearly would have passed definition of defamatory material and the lawsuit would have been successful. Perhaps the most alarming allegations brought up by Deere was the allegations of failure to obtain proper ethics approval for his tests. It's alleged that while he did obtain ethics approval, he operated outside the scope of that approval and that he did not obtain informed consent from the parents. The tests involved colonoscopies, including colorectal biopsies on the children, lumbar punctures on the children, and obtaining blood samples at his son's birthday party. These violations would later be the subject of a General Medical Council investigation that would result in Wakefield having his medical license revoked. In the investigation, Deere interviewed a Dr. Nicholas Chadwick. Chadwick at the time was a student of Wakefield's, and he had designed an experiment to detect the presence of measles in tissue samples. The test was rather sensitive for its day, and Chadwick was able to present the method as a publication and was also used in one of Wakefield's patents. During the initial pilot study, Chadwick conducted tests on the samples obtained from the children, which proved negative. Wakefield claims to have published the negative results somewhere, though I have been unable to obtain such a publication. However, the test for the presence of measles was omitted entirely from the 1998 paper, instead claiming in the paper, "We did not prove an association between measles, mumps and rubella vaccine and the syndrome described. Virological studies are underway that may help resolve the issue." Which is despite the fact that the virological studies had been conducted and failed to find a link. He claims that this is due to it being uncommon practice to publish negative results. However, this is a false statement. He later claims in a statement on a website, which unfortunately no longer exists, but his statement is mirrored in several locations. "By the time we applied the viral detection technology to the intestinal tissues of the children with autism, new and more sensitive technology had come to my attention. This includes a technique of TACMan PCR and was the state-of-the-art technology being used by few expert centres, including that of Professor John Leary, then at Cornell University in New York. I went to New York to meet John O'Leary. He presented evidence that his technique could detect down to 2 viral copies, compared with Nick Chadwick's 10,000. The advantages were obvious, and the possibility that Nick Chadwick's results were falsely negative, i.e. showed that the virus was present in the tissues but at very low levels that Nick Chadwick's technique could not detect, could now be addressed by the new technology. Using John O'Leary's technology, the virus was detected in controlled studies, and these results were published. They confirmed that our previous results were falsely negative due to the limitation of the techniques that we were using. TACMan PCR, one of the techniques used by John O'Leary to detect measles virus in the autistic children, is now the gold standard, and the technology used by Nick Chadwick has been abandoned. On entirely scientific grounds, I was proven correct on this occasion. The facts stated above can be supported by contemporaneous documentation. Essentially what he's saying is that the gut samples from the 1998 study did contain the measles virus. However, Chadwick's method was not sensitive enough to pick up the presence of measles, and when the samples were retested in 2002 using more sensitive equipment, he was able to detect measles. This brings me back to Wakefield's 1997 patent application, UK patent number GB2325856A, titled Pharmaceutical Composition for the Treatment of MMR Virus-Mediated Disease Comprising a Transfer Factor Obtained from the Dialysis of Virus-Specific Lymphocytes. Recalling that the 1998 pilot study failed to detect any measles virus in the children examined, and the first claim of finding the virus was in 2002, the patent, citing the as-yet-to-be-published study, claims beginning page 4, line 10, in these children, the mean interval from exposure to the MMR vaccine to the development of the first behavioural symptoms was 6 days, indicating a strong temporal association with exposure to the vaccine. Measles virus neocapsid protein antigen has been identified within the follicular dendritic cells in areas of lymphoidal nodular hyperplasia in the affected intestine, further implicating a causal role for the measles virus in this disease. In other words, the patent claims not only does MMR cause autism, but also that the measles virus had been detected in 1997 in the guts of affected children. Also, page 18, line 10. Positive staining for measles was detected in children for whom the onset of symptoms had been associated with clinical episode of measles in 1 case, but previously vaccinated with MMR, and MMR in 3 cases. In the case of the 5th positive child, no exposure had been noted. Onset of behavioural symptoms started at 18 months and his only recorded exposure to either measles or rubella as MMR at 16 months of age. In other words, he claims to have detected a persistent measles infection in the guts of children who had been vaccinated with MMR but had subsequently contracted measles, and also a child who had been vaccinated with MMR and had not contracted measles. Again, this is a patent application from 1997, where he's claiming to have detected the measles virus in autistic children who had received the MMR vaccine. This is a year before the 1998 study was released, where he claims that he couldn't detect the measles virus because his tests weren't sensitive enough. And it wasn't until 2002 where he claims to have detected the measles virus in these same samples using more sensitive equipment. Wakefield also responded to Deere's allegations that the patent, being for a competing vaccine to the MMR, presented a conflict of interest, most recently in his promotional video for the 2016 propaganda film Vaxxed.
Another allegation is that I was in my mountain lair secretly making this single vaccine, which was a competitor to MMR, and put MMR out of the market, discredit it, and then bring my own vaccine onto the market and clean up. That was the idea from Brian Deere. What we had at the time was a patent. The medical school owned the patent, not me, and it was a patent on a thing called transfer factor. It's a naturally occurring nutritional supplement that occurs in breast milk, for example, that boosts the immune response. Whether it worked or not is another question. That's what we sought to try and find out. But it boosts the immune response to an infection like measles. This could not prevent children from getting measles. So it didn't act like MMR at all. What it did was to help them clear the virus once they became infected. It could never have competed with MMR vaccine. Never, because it did not work in the right way. And this was explained in great detail to Brian Deere, and he completely ignored it. It remained that it was a competitor to MMR, and I was simply trying to clean up financially and put this onto the market.
Numerous other videos of him making this claim are also available. Of course, the patent himself is at odds with his claims, starting with the first line. The present invention relates to a new vaccine/immunization for the prevention and/or prophylaxis against measles virus infection and to a pharmaceutical or therapeutic composition for the treatment of irritable bowel disease, particularly for Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis, and regressive behavioural disease. Furthermore, on page 2, line 26, what is needed is therefore a safer vaccine which does not give rise to these problems, and the treatment for those with existing irritable bowel disease. I have now discovered a combined vaccine/therapeutic agent, which is not only probably safer to administer to children and others by way of vaccination/immunization, but which can also be used to treat irritable bowel disease, where there is a complete cure or to alleviate symptoms. Furthermore, UK patent GB 2347742A, titled Pharmaceutical Composition for Regressive Behavioural Disease, claims in its abstract, the invention provides a method for the diagnosis of regressive behavioural disease from a body-derived sample, which method comprises performing an assay for persistent MMR infection in said sample. The invention also provides a pharmaceutical composition for the treatment of regressive behavioural disorder, which comprises as a soluble dialyzed leukocyte extract of an MMR antigen-specific transfer factor formed by dialysis of a molecular weight cutoff of 12,500 in a pharmaceutically acceptable carrier diluent thereof. The fact that both these patents were applied for before the 1998 study suggests a motivated intention to provide a link between the MMR vaccine and autism for the purpose of recommending a safer vaccine, as well as providing a test kit to diagnose autism by detecting a persistent MMR infection. Moving forward to the 2002 study, where the claim was made that Wakefield had detected measles virus in the tissue samples obtained from the children with autism, there is a brilliant video by YouTube user Concordance, which I will link to in the show notes, outlining the problems with this study. However, to summarise, Wakefield used a state-of-the-art instrument that is able to detect very low levels of virus in a tissue sample using enzymes and a chain reaction to amplify DNA strands. As the DNA is replicated, it is detected by fluorescence. However, like most scientific equipment, this instrument has a certain level of background noise. In the case of this instrument, is present in the form of baseline drift. The fluorescence of the sample will increase slowly over time due to unavoidable contaminants in the reagents. While it was not common at the time to submit raw data, a subsequent investigation into the raw data from this study found that Wakefield had overwritten the detection threshold of the instrument and set it so low that it registered a positive result off background noise. The only indication of this was in the final paper, with the emission of control samples, which in this case were deionized water, because they also registered positive for measles due to the low threshold that the machine had been set. Since the machine set the threshold automatically based off the blank samples, this override was a deliberate act, not an accident. As for the samples themselves, they appeared the same as the control. In other words, there was no measles virus present in these samples, despite Wakefield's study indicating otherwise. Following Deere's 2004 investigation, the 1998 paper as well as a paper from 2000 were partially retracted, and following further investigation they were fully retracted in 2010. This retraction was a result of failure to disclose potential conflicts of interest and evidence of manipulation of data. The alleged ethics violations were also considered but did not play a major role in the retraction of this article. This point will later become relevant. In a 2004 letter to The Lancet, Wakefield defended his involvement with litigation, claiming it had no bearing on the results of the study, nor was any funding received from the Legal Aid Board in regards to his study, again at odds with the comments made by lawyer Richard Barr. Interestingly, in the letter he remarked, "No claim of causal association with MMR was ever made," which is true for the 1998 paper, though it could be argued that despite the disclaimer it was heavily implied. But this is certainly not the case for the patents filed a year earlier, nor for subsequent studies, or the press release accompanying the 1998 paper. Wakefield still maintains that he has never claimed a causal link between MMR and autism. However, he makes strong implications to that effect. He will stand behind people as they explicitly state a causal link, and even directed a propaganda film that explicitly stated a causal link several times, even if those exact words were never uttered by he himself. In 2010, Wakefield faced an inquiry from the General Medical Council. As a result of perceived ethics violations, both he and co-author John Walker Smith had their medical license revoked. They were no longer able to call themselves doctor and no longer able to practice medicine. A third party was exonerated by the council. Both Wakefield and Walker Smith appealed the decision. In 2012, Walker Smith won his appeal to the British High Court. In their decision, the High Court stated that the colonoscopies and lumbar punctures were medically justified and therefore within the scope of the ethics approval for the study. Wakefield, who by this stage had revoked his appeal, has since used this as a vindication for himself, as well as declaring it as evidence that he is being persecuted by the Lancet for refusing to reinstate his paper. However, the retraction of the paper was based on issues beyond the scope of the General Medical Council, as well as the fact that Wakefield had more allegations levelled against him than Walker Smith that will still need addressing if he were to reinstate his appeal, most obviously being the very serious violation of collecting blood samples at his son's birthday party. I will let Wakefield address the birthday party story himself.
Yes, the blood samples at my son's birthday party. In order to study the children with autism, we were examining their blood samples. We needed blood samples from healthy children. And of course, in hospital, you don't see healthy children. You see children who are sick. And so my wife suggested that we have a birthday party coming up. Maybe we can get some blood from our children and children at the birthday party. And I thought that was a reasonable idea. It was done with fully informed child and parental consent. Fully informed. It was entirely ethical. It was no worse, for example, than going to CVS and having a shot. In fact, probably substantially better. And it was done by a highly experienced general practitioner, not by me, and there were no problems at all. The only problem was that it did not have an approval from the Hospital Ethics Committee. That does not make it unethical. It was done, as I say, with fully informed child and parental consent. So that's the story. Do I regret it? Yes. Not because it was unethical, it wasn't, but because it gave the General Medical Council a concrete reason for then taking away my license. It was a mistake, and if I did it again, I would do so with the appropriate ethical approval. And so therefore it's something I regret. But was it at any stage unethical? No.
Despite what Wakefield claims here, it was a very serious ethics violation. Conducting such activities without prior ethics approval, regardless of whether parental consent was given, is a very serious breach of ethical standards and alone would present justification for Wakefield to have his license revoked. In this previous clip, he nonchalantly underplays the seriousness of his violations. However, anyone who is a practicing medical doctor of 17 years and an academic of 10 years would be well aware of how serious a breach this would be. In the modern day, it's important to remember what Wakefield's initial claims were, and what he will continue to defend if left to his own devices. Those claims were that the MMR vaccine, and specifically the MMR vaccine, was responsible for a gut infection that in turn caused a form of autism. In the subsequent press conference and many times since, he has strongly advocated for the use of monovalent measles vaccine, not mentioning any other vaccines. No mention in the initial publication, any other publications, or when he's giving the interview alone, is given to total immune load, or aluminium, or mercury, or to any other vaccines, as being any relation to autism. He very specifically mentioned MMR. He will also claim that he is not against vaccines in general, reiterating that he was a strong advocate for the monovalent measles vaccine. However, when in the presence of people who believe otherwise, he will conform to whichever group he is present with. He chooses his words carefully so as never, though in practice never becomes rarely, to explicitly state something which might not align with his original claims. However, he will never refute others' claims. If questioned on a link between thimerosal and autism, for example, by someone who pushes that hypothesis, he will cite others who believe in it. He will claim the safety studies were not adequately conducted, and he will talk about mercury being a neurotoxin. He will not, however, reiterate at this stage that his original claim was constrained to the MMR vaccine alone. When in a room full of aluminium theorists, he will talk about his associations with people who believe that aluminium is bad. When in a room full of people who believe that all vaccines cause autism, he will make no mention of his advocacy for monovalent measles vaccine, though on his own he will insist that he has always advocated for the monovalent measles vaccine. Rather, he will talk about a perceived lack of safety trials which are not funded by pharmaceutical companies, or talk about conspiracy theories involving scientists being silenced. He's become a chameleon of ideas, a man who will make his money off being the face of fear and suspicion of the medical industry, and perpetuating that fear. With frequent paid speaking appearances, books, and a propaganda film that pulled $1 million in its first year, Wakefield seems to be benefiting off the controversy that he initially created of a string of fraudulent studies and the misery of vulnerable children. And that is where I'm going to leave that. If you'd like to make a contribution to the show, you can make a per episode contribution at patreon.com. That is patreon.com/thebunk. You can also go to our website, thebunk.com.au, and click on the link up the top to go to PayPal and make a one-off contribution there if you so wish. If you have any stories to recommend, you can go to our website as well, go into the Contact Us section, and there'll be a place where you can recommend stories for us to investigate. If you would like to help us out, but that sounds like too much work, you can also give us a big hand by going onto iTunes or Stitcher and give us a rating there. Tell everyone how much you love us. That is where I'm going to leave it. This is James sitting alone drinking his wine, and I will say farewell to you all. I will see you next week. All right, so it's just you and me alone. You person who waits until the end to listen to all the post-credit shenanigans. I'm lying down on the couch here, feeling very relaxed. So you may have noticed that there was no show last week. That's entirely my fault. We did record a show. It was 2.5 hours. And I checked the audio before we recorded, but not during. So when I got home to do the mixing, I found that I had 2 copies of my audio signal and none of Lucy's, so it was just 2 hours of me talking to myself. 2.5 hours of me talking to myself, actually. So yeah, that's why there was no show last week. And yeah, Lucy's off sick this week. Hopefully I won't be off sick next week. I have a bit of a loogie going. Bit of a sore throat. Drink the wine to make it go away.